Hey guys, how's it going? This is Kryz. In this video, we are gonna cover how to implement an item stash system. It's gonna support having multiple chests where we can store and retrieve our items from. In this video, we're gonna be making a new script for the item stash, and then we'll be making some changes to the inventory, item container, and character classes. Let's start by creating the item stash script in the examples folder. For the item stash script, we are going to need some functionalities that are very close to the item chest script. So let's just go over there and copy the script in its entirety into the item stash. We won't need the item and the amount variables or the inventory, and we won't need the color either. Since the inventory is gone, we can delete these lines that are going to try to find the inventory. And since the item is also gone, we can delete this line that sets the sprite render to the item's icon. The update method is going to be fairly different, so let's just delete all of its contents for now. We will also not need the empty variable and the collision code. Well, that's going to be very similar. The thing that we are definitely going to need is to have this extend from item container. We want to be able to add and remove items from this item stash. To do that, we are certainly going to need, just as we did in the inventory, to assign listeners to the events of all of the item slots in the item stash. But we don't really want to copy and paste this code over there. It's preferable to avoid code duplication wherever possible. So instead, we are going to move this code into the item container class. That is the base class for both the item stash and the inventory. And this way, the code will be shared between the two. So let's move the event declarations. And let's also move the start method, except for the setStartingItems function call. In here, we are going to need to use the system namespace. And let's also mark the start method as protected and virtual. This way, we can go into the inventory, and if we take a look at the warning that Visual Studio is displaying for us in the start method, it says that it hides the inherited member start from the item container class. Because now that the base class for the inventory also has a start method, what we should be doing is actually overriding that. We should change this method to also be protected, override, and now before calling the setStartingItems method, we are going to call the base version of the start method, meaning the start method in the item container. This way it will assign all of the listeners to the slots, and only after that is it going to set starting items. Similarly, let's also implement the onValidate method as protected and virtual in the item container base class, just for convenience. But then, when overriding that method in the inventory class, since we have our own custom way of getting the item slots, by looking for them only on children of this item's parent game object, we will not call the base version of the method. While we're here, I'd like to also make a few extra adjustments. I want to pass through to the includeInActive variable of the getComponentsInChildren method. This way, it will find the item slots to add to the item slots array, even if the objects are disabled. I also want to remove the formerly serialized as attribute, because after being serialized with the new name, you no longer need this attribute. I just never got around to remove it. So let's remove this. And also remove the unnecessary using statements. I want to do the same to the getComponentsInChildren call in the item container base class. Now, back in the item stash script, we need to change the onValidate to protected and override. And we also want to get our item slots by doing something very similar to the inventory with an item's parent variable. So let's just copy and paste this over there. And in this instance, I feel that copy and pasting isn't a very big deal, because this behavior isn't generic enough that it justifies being in the item container base class. Before we do anything else in this script, let's go over to the Unity editor and create the 3D objects and UI for our item stash so that we have something physical to interact with. I won't go into too much detail on this. The item stash is essentially just a copy of the item chest. I created a new material and changed the cube to use that material. The script is also not the item chest script, of course, it is the item stash script. As for the UI window, I copied the crafting window, swapped the vertical layout into a grid layout, removed the crafting recipe UIs, leaving only a single item slot, and then replicated that item slot about 30 times just to fill the window. Since this is a scroll view, we can create as many item slots as we want, and then we will be able to scroll through them. Now the important part is coming over to our item stash parent object, the one that has the script on it, and dragging the item stash window game object into the items parent variable. We can verify that the item slots have been automatically filled. For the interaction of our item stash, we want our player to be able to open the item stash UI window when he is close enough to the item stash and he presses a button. Let's change the name of the variable to reflect its purpose better. It's not the item pickup keycode anymore, it's the open keycode. And we'll use this variable inside the input getKeyDown method. We want our UI to open with the press of a key and to close when we press that same key again. So to do that, we need to keep track of its open state. When that key is pressed, we revert the state of this variable. If it was true before, it's now going to be false, and if it was false, it's now going to be true. After doing this, we can set the items parent game object, and using the setActive method, passing in the isOpen variable. So if by pressing the key, we made our inventory be open by setting isOpen to true, we will also enable the game object. Besides that, let's make sure the window starts out closed by overriding the start method. After calling base.start, we are going to set itemsParent.gameObject setActive false. And if the player moves far away enough from the item stash, even if he doesn't press the keycode to close the stash, we still want it to close automatically. So if we are not in range anymore and it is open, we are gonna want to set it to closed. Let's make a quick test just to make sure that everything is working as we expect. The window starts out closed. If we move close to the chest, we can press E to open the window. Pressing it again closes it, and if we have it open and we simply move away, it also closes automatically. Now, going into the last part of our implementation of the item stash, what we need to do is essentially hook the item stash's events into all of these methods in the character script. And remember, we might have several item stashes. We can't just simply add the item stash variable in here as we did for all of the other windows, which are unique. So whenever we open one item stash, we want to tell that the onPointerEnter event of that item stash is going to call the showTooltip method, the onBeginDrag event is going to call the BeginDrag method, and so on and so forth. We also probably want to tell the inventory that the right-click event no longer triggers this inventory right-click method, which equips items or uses them. Instead, we want to tell the inventory that right-clicking items on it will move them to the item stash. And similarly, when we right-click items in the item stash, we want to tell them that they go into the inventory. And then, when we close the item stash, we want to revert all of that. We want to tell that item stash that the onPointerEnter events and etc. no longer trigger these methods, and we want to reset the right-click event for the inventory back to the normal inventory right-click method. So let's scroll down to the bottom of the character class and implement two new public methods: open item container and close item container. And yes, in here we will use the more generic item container class instead of using item stash specifically, because it is very likely that we want to have this very similar behavior for several different types of item containers. In case we want specific behaviors for specific types of item containers, we can always implement methods with the exact same signature, except receiving as an input parameter the specific item container type that we want, and it will be handled automatically by C#. So as we said, we want to hook all of these methods into the events of the item container that we're opening. When opening it, we use the += operator to add the methods as listeners to the events, and when we close it, we remove them by using the - operator. But as we also said, we also want our inventory to no longer equip items on right-click. And we want to tell the inventory that its right-click method is now going to transfer items into the item container. And similarly to that, we want to tell the item container that his right-click event is going to transfer items into the inventory. And these methods don't exist yet, so let's create them. For the transfer, we'll need to store a reference to the item container that is currently open. In the transfer to item container method, we'll need to store a reference to the item in the item slot. If it's not null, we'll need to check if it can be added to the item container, and in that case, we will remove it from the inventory and add it to the item container. If the item is null, or it can't be added to the item container, we simply won't do anything. In the transfer to inventory method, it's exactly the same thing, but we'll just swap the inventory with the open item container. When closing the item container, we need to do the reverse and restore all of these events back to normal. We need to re-add the inventory right-click to the inventory, remove the transfer from item container, and the transfer to inventory, and set the item container variable to null. Back in the item stash side, we need to get the reference to the character that is opening the item container, and we'll see how in just a moment. And then, when we actually open it, we need to call the open item container method, passing in the keyword this to refer to this game object that is an item stash. And when we close it, we want to call the close item container method. To get the reference to the character, in the check collision method, we already know that we are colliding with an object with the player tag. And that is exactly the object that has the character script on it. So we can simply do a getComponent call on that game object. So if our character is just entering the range of the item stash, we can simply do a getComponent call and get the reference to the character script. And when we are leaving the range of the item stash, we can set the character variable to null. And also very important that we don't forget, when we are leaving the range of the item stash but the window is still open, we want to close it, and we also want to call the close item container method in the character class. But since we are assigning null to the character, we need to do this piece of code before we do that assignment. Otherwise, we'll get the very famous null reference exception. And voila, we have a working item stash. And since we did this all quite dynamic, there are no fixed variables, we can very easily just duplicate this item stash along with its accompanying UI and simply have it just work. We now have two different item stashes where we can store different items. Even drag and drop just works, whether it is from the inventory to the stash, from stash to inventory, or even from the stash directly to the equipment panel. There's just one thing that we have to be careful of. If we are in range of two different item stashes at once, we currently have no code to select which one of them is going to be opened, so if we try to open both of them at once, it's going to lead to undefined behavior. Other than that, everything should work just as expected. Different items in different item stashes. I hope this video has been useful, and I hope to see you in the next one.